we have just 3 more to go till the end of our season for this year, so you're not going to want to miss any one of the next ones coming up. They're going to be great. Next week we'll be talking about, and I have to look this up, climbing the geology of Rock Mountain National Park. And Connor has been with us before. I think you're going to enjoy that. Danielle, one of our curators, is going to be doing the next week, and I'm not even sure on her topic. Myths and legends, it says. And then our final one will be Adam Thomas, and he, some of you may have heard of him last year, professor at CSU, and he always brings fascinating stories up with us, so that'll be a fun one. Tonight we have a special event with the sheriff here, so everybody sit up straight in your chair. Put on your mask, do all your good stuff. So, when I introduce my speakers, I try and tell you a little bit about them. And Justin goes back a long way in our family. And so I could tell you lots of fun stories, but I'm not going to do that. I want to tell you something about the heart of the person. And Justin is not only our county sheriff, but he is like I said, a longtime family friend. And I think stories that tell who he is are right after the flood. One of the first things that went out in 2013 when we had the giant flood was the internet and the phones and whatever. Justin has been a friend for so long that when he flew over in his helicopter on the day after Estes Park really fell apart, he sent a picture to my kids to tell them that the inn was still standing and that everything was okay. So that kind of just tells you what kind of person he is. He really knows the business owners and the people in town, and he cares about them. He then, a couple of weeks later, we're still getting free sandbags from FEMA or somebody, I don't know where. I had loaded up my car. I had seen him over at the sandbag distribution point, and he apparently noticed that I was alone, and he followed me up here, and he helped me sandbag my place. I mean, nobody needs to do that. I mean, how many other things does he have to do? So that's how cool he is. Now, again, the other stories, we'll just kind of maybe leave those. The 2 o'clock in the morning cherry pies. Justin's first beat as a sheriff county sheriff in Larimer was right here at Baldpate Inn. And so that's why we go back so long. But I've always felt safe and secure, and every time my name pops up on the police log, he does call and say, "So you let an armed lost hiker into the building at 2 o'clock in the morning? What were you thinking?" So we take care of each other. But anyways, Justin Smith.
I appreciate the introduction. I actually had expected a lot more stories, and my only way to refute it was some of them may not be true. Those stories are very nice, and I appreciate it. But first of all, just to get a feel, so I kind of know who I've got. How many folks are Estes area residents in here this evening? Part-time. Okay, no, good. Any folks from just completely out of state, out of the area? Half the year. Well, no, I'm just looking to kind of get an idea who knows the area, who's been around here a little bit. So it looks like the vast majority are familiar with the area, and you're not just in for in for a week or so. It gives me a little idea. A little background on myself. Actually a Kansas native. I like to tell people I grew up along the Santa Fe Trail, just a couple miles south of the town I grew up in, and then I ended up moving out here and lived just off of where the Overland Trail is. And for me, you fall in, I come to discover how interesting that is, and it really brings the history of the settlement of the West. So for me, it's become a fascination. And as I look at this crowd, I feel good because I know some of these references I'm going to make you know. I was afraid it might be too young and I had people just look at me, but here's what brought me out. I'm here today because of a man by the name of James Michener. You all know the story of Centennial, and the reason I say James Michener is responsible for me being here was when I was in high school, back in Kansas in the 80s, I had a history teacher who taught the history of the West using Centennial. He would teach a block, and he'd follow it with that episode of Centennial. And I got to admit, Kansas is full of great people, but when I saw what went on out here and I learned the story of the West as told by Michener, I went, I got to go there. I've got to be there. And so that was actually in 1986. I got a chance to watch that. And coincidentally, that very next summer, I was still a student in high school. Last of 3 children. My parents were kind of done with kids. So when I said I'd like to go to Estes Park for the summer at 17 years old, they went, that sounds like a great idea. And so I came out and I spent 2 summers, 86 and 87, working at the YMCA at the livery stable there. Back when Steve Wilson owned it. I don't know if anybody here would know Steve and Evelyn Wilson, but they had the livery, and I worked 2 years there. I stayed back in Kansas for a summer, and then I came back out to what was the Aspen Lodge, now the Dow House, and spent 2 more summers working out there. And it just hit me, wow, this is an amazing area. What if I could actually, make that my home? And miraculously, when I graduated from college, that was an electric typewriter. It was a typewriter. I typed out all the letters of interest, and the only place I really heard back from was Larimer County. And it was when, for those of you who've been around, when Richard Shockley got elected back in 1990, he was hiring deputies. So I got hired out here, and it was amazing because I continued to get to know the history. Now, this may not be new to some of you, but one of the things I find fascinating is my interest in Centennial as it was done as a movie was the fact, everybody knows about Lily Lake? Yeah. The rendezvous. If you look at that episode of Centennial at the Mountain Man Rendezvous, that was at Lily Lake, if you didn't know it. That was the backdrop. That was back before it was National Park. It was still privately owned. And the other major scene that always gets back to me, if you don't know it, up the Poudre Canyon. Everybody know where Pasquinel's cabin is in the Poudre Canyon? Okay, cool. I know something I can share. So if you go up past Rustic, right before you get to the fish hatchery up there, just a little ways down, maybe a quarter mile to the east, you go south and you wander your way down to the Poudre River. And there's the remnants of a log cabin that was built for the set that was, if you saw the scenes of Pasquinel's cabin along the river. It's there. And if you dig in, so they did it in the movie way, that when they went to mud it, they filled it with newspaper and then put mud over it. And I don't know if you can still find it, but several years ago when I was up there, you could see the newspapers from the 1970s when they constructed that. So when I found out I was in the heart of where that story was set, I went, this is just amazing. So I came here, and as Lois mentioned, my first assignment after I was trained in the Valley was back up here in Estes, which for a 22-year-old lad was just paradise. They get a 22-year-old, they gave me a pistol, a rifle, a shotgun, a Jeep Cherokee, and they sent me to Estes Park, mostly unsupervised. Not sure it was a great idea. But as Lois said, I've always had an affinity for getting to know folks. I didn't grow up in a law enforcement family. I grew up in a business family. My parents came off the farms in Oklahoma. My dad was a pharmacist, small business. My mom opened a small business after I graduated. So the business folks have always been at my heart. And when I worked nights up here in Estes, and that shift would get off at 2 in the morning. I was on call till 4 in the morning. And so I had 2 hours that I could go home and sleep and wait for the pager to go off, or I could find something to do. And that's when I found the Baldpate Inn. And that's when I found out not only was here, but that's when Lois bakes the pies. And I found out that Lois was a little bit lonely that time of night and was willing to not only give me a cup of coffee, but I found out if you were the right person, you knew Lois, the day-old pie would be yours to go with the cup of coffee. So we shared lots of nights back about a year and a half worth. I would come up and again, got to know the family, Mackenzie and Jennifer and Lois and Mike at the time, get to know the whole family, Duke. For anybody who was around long enough to know Duke, the family dog that was here. So really got that appreciation. So I've kept in touch with Lois over the years. And when I found about this series, and Mackenzie put something out about, hey, they're looking for speakers. I went, well, if you'll have me, I'd love to come up and share some of the things on the history of Colorado, the history of Larimer County, and kind of how we're founded, and to kind of weave in a little bit about what the office of sheriff is. And we're in a time right now of great turmoil in our nation, a lot of questions on policing and what is going on or should go on, et cetera. And I just find as a self-taught student of history, I find it interesting as we're cycling around, because when this area settled, we were desperate for some kind of rule of law, for law and order, because it just didn't exist. And we built that slowly, and now there's people that are trying to dismantle that. So my biggest challenge this evening is I've got about 4 or 5 hours worth of things I'd love to share. And Mackenzie's going to cut me off in an hour. I'm just going to keep him behind that pole so I can't see him. And so I'm going to share some things that I've learned about the settling of the West and kind of the pre-story of how we got here, and a little bit about Larimer County, and hopefully some things that even if you're locals, you didn't know. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to go into the Estes Park history. I know the basics. I'm not the expert at that. There's people that know that. So forgive me for not referring to the historical things up here. I'm going to focus on kind of how we settled and how Larimer County settled, some unique pieces. Again, my degrees are in criminal justice. They're not in history, but I actually, my wife, she thinks I'm crazy. I lay in bed at night with the covers over my head, reading historical articles on my iPad. She sleeps right through it. But so I'm self-taught in this, and so this is bits and pieces I picked up. I've become a real student of buying, or a consumer of books off of eBay. Some amazing 100, 150, 200-year-old books I get for just a little bit of money, and I love to find out what's going on. And for those that wonder how I got up here, as the sheriff, I should ride up on a horse, correct? Yes? Well, taking care of it. I did 4 years with horses. I know how much they cost. So if you saw the steel horse parked out front in the way of a BMW motorcycle, that was my ride up here. I admit I came a little early and I checked out the area, but that's my ride up. That's my horse here and back. Just a little bit on the settling of the West. The thing that hits me is I've come to understand that history. It really is about a people who were, as we settled this country, never satisfied with what we had. I don't mean that in a negative way. Always looking for adventure, looking for something more. And in that settling, we all know the story of 1776 and how the nation was founded. But it wasn't long before we weren't really happy just staying there, to stay on the East Coast. And those of us that continued, our families moved west. And really up to the early 1800s, 1820s, they kind of hit the Mississippi and stopped there and moved on to the Missouri. And so along about the 1820s, we really started to see that movement forward. Now, if you go south of us to the southwest, the founding goes clear back into the 1600s. Places like Santa Fe go back to the 60s, a very different part down there. But as they moved west, originally most of that was trapping and trading. And it was for animal furs originally, and it was a lot of the French-Canadian trappers that came out of Canada and down into that area. And they were on foot, they were on horseback, didn't require great trails and stuff. They just followed the rivers, and as you may be aware, the beaver is what really drove them out in this direction. And the beaver was so popular with the hats of the day, and so the beaver trade really went like 1825 to 1840 era, and a lot of that originally followed the Missouri River. That's the reason that most of that trapping and trading occurred really up in the Montana region, at the headwaters of that major river. They followed it, out of Missouri. Truth be told, up in that period, 1840s to 1850s, nobody really came to Colorado. There's a few traders and trappers that came out this way and settled, but if they were going to cross the country, they weren't coming through here. And the reason they didn't is the same reason that we're here tonight, is these beautiful Rocky Mountains. A good Lord put them right in the middle and required people that wanted to go around to go south, follow the Arkansas River, hit Bent's Fort, go down, and a lot of trading went on with the Mexican people at the time. And then they went up north and west, and they found those routes across. Now the key to that was, if they were coming west, the last major point and the biggest fort that really was out there was Fort Laramie. How many folks, by a show of hands, have been to Fort Laramie? Not the city of Laramie. Awesome. So well over half have been to Fort Laramie. What an amazing place along the North Platte River to see how they came. They settled. It was the big post before they started through the mountains. So if you went up to the 1840s, that's when the beaver pelt hat went out of, like everything, went out of style. All of a sudden, these trappers and traders that had worked with the Indians found they really weren't needed. So then they moved to being the people who helped guide individuals that wanted to get across to what we refer to as the Oregon Territory. Really everything on the west coast, on north of California. They were guiding those folks across, and in the 1840s, the Mormons were fleeing persecution, so they came across. The interesting thing, if you didn't realize, Mormons traveled the north side of the Platte River mostly, and the Oregon Trail was on the south side, so there was mostly a split in there. But so they came across that way, and again, there was really no reason to settle Colorado. There's a few people here, and obviously the natives were here, but Europeans didn't come here. There really wasn't a reason to, up until about 1858. And in 1858 was when the first discovery of the Pikes Peak region of gold was located. And one of the stories that I read, actually, and this is a book I got on Fort Laramie that was written in the early 1900s, talked about two Indians that brought gold up they had found in the rivers and just knew it was something they could trade for. And some other miners that found some gold. They referred to the Pikes Peak region, but mainly it was down Cherry Creek, Auraria, where Denver has settled. And so that started all these folks who were going to come west. And so at that same time, our nation, was, as you know, was on the cusp of a civil war. We had bloody Kansas. There was a lot of fighting going on. And the Union recognized they needed to be flush with funds, the American U.S. government. And so they recognized they needed to get in those gold fields. The last major gold strike had been in '49, the 49ers in California. So that had kind of, gone through its piece. And they saw gold in Colorado, which obviously wasn't Colorado at the time. And so that movement began. What's interesting with it is that at that point in time, there really was no law and order out here. So when the miners showed up, they were in trouble. Because obviously where you have money and you have opportunities, there were a lot of thieves that followed. There was really no way to declare your mine claim because there was no real legal system, because it was the territory of Nebraska and the territory of Kansas. So if we were in 1858, where would we have been right here today? I thought that as a Kansan for many years until I studied it and find these maps online. Actually, Kansas-Nebraska territory split just a little bit south of Long's Peak. So we were actually in the Nebraska territory up here.
No,
there's the Nebraskans right there. Celebrate, do your dance. Speaking of old technologies, I still have a pager. But with that, what they ran into is we were part of those territories, but if we were in the Nebraska territory, we were in what was referred to as the unorganized region. If you went more than about a quarter of the way west from the very eastern side of Nebraska, and I've got an 1858 map, it's got counties, then it's got unorganized territory all the way to the Continental Divide. And so the problem was, you had no law set up. Well, you go to Kansas, they were a little more on top of it. They weren't like Nebraska. So they had that tiny little sliver that was regular counties, but then everything west of where I was at, Wichita, McPherson is the town I grew up in by Salina. Everything west there was Arapahoe County, which didn't really help out a whole lot either, to have one county that went from basically I-135 in Kansas all the way to the Continental Divide. So again, you really had no law and order out here, and so they realized they had to do something. And who's familiar with the Jefferson Territory? This is fascinating. So we all know we became the Colorado Territory before we were state, 1861. However, in 1858, in that gold strike, they went, we got to get some things going out here. So the initial proposal in 1858, 1859 was to establish the Jefferson Territory. It was going to be everything that is Colorado up to just south of Casper in Wyoming. It was going to cover all that. A little bit further west than we are, and pretty much the east line. And I've actually read the original proposed statutes for the territory of Jefferson, and they put those together, but the United States government never really bought off on it in that period. So 58, 59 into 60, they had declared themselves the Jefferson Territory. They had appointed a governor, all these officers, but we really didn't exist. So they refer to it as the extra legal territory of Jefferson. So that was the first shot at it. And in that, what we know as Larimer County was mostly laid out. It was going to be called Heel County, Heele. I've yet to find out who in the world Heel was, but I'm still working on it. So that was what was originally proposed, but it was their attempt to bring things together, because the only thing they had was these miners' courts where they kind of got together and decided what they were going to do. And they also had what they referred to as vigilance committees, where the term vigilante comes from. And what the vigilance committee, with the best of intentions, was you as neighbors, if you found a crime occurred, you put together a posse, you went after the person you believed did it, you brought them back in, you established the vigilance committee, which was kind of judge, jury, and executioner, because they would go seek the person. They would hold trial. Now, they gave them a fair trial, because the trial, they usually were captured in the morning, tried by noon, and executed in the afternoon. So they gave, due process. But that's truly what it was. You were left on your own at that point in time to find your own justice. Now, what's interesting is you read about it, there were 3 punishments typically for crimes that would be administered by a vigilance committee. The first, on the lowest level of crimes, was 39 lashings. I don't know why 39, they said 39 lashings. So it was corporal punishment. Number 2, for something a little bit more, was banishment. Simply, you, out. You have to leave the territory, leave the area, whatever. And the third was execution. And as simple as that sounds, they said, for things that we think of as minor theft, theft of gold from the miners. You see, that took that kind of personal. Theft of livestock. To have your horse stolen at that point in time meant almost certain death. So if your horse was stolen, horse thieves really were treated to execution. And they said actually murder wasn't as big a deal, because oftentimes it was more mutual combat. So sometimes murder wasn't even treated as that big a deal. But don't steal a horse and don't steal my gold. So the vigilance committees came together, and they did it with the best of intentions, and they came together and they dissolved. They really didn't have rules. They kind of brought you forth and said, tell us why you didn't do it, and somebody else would present the other side. Most times they were found guilty. So that's really all we had at that point in time. And you can imagine what a world that was. Really, it was the roughest ruled the territory. And again, as the gold rush came in, you saw a lot of ruffians and criminals come behind it. Now, what's interesting is we talk about the gold. Most of that, for my Nebraska friends, was actually on the Kansas side, because there's not much gold found on the north end of Colorado, this North Peak. Larimer County itself actually was one of the original 17 counties that was established. There were 17 territorial counties from 61 to 1876, and never really had any mining. There's the old Eugenia mine up here that not really much of anything. There was a bit of a gold strike in a place called Manhattan. For those familiar with the Poudre Canyon, you go north at Rustic, a few miles up there towards Red Feather, and there's an abandoned area that for a few years, it was sponsored by some business interests in Fort Collins. They found some gold, not a lot. And then Teller City, which is over in Jackson County where Walden is, had a silver strike for a few years. And if you ever get a chance to go over there, it's off the highway a bit. There's still remnants of that old ghost town there. Now, the interesting piece is I told you about Larimer County. You have to know we were one of the 17 first. Well, obviously, from 17, we're now up to 64. We've split. But Larimer was one of the originals. We're currently 2,600 square miles and some change. We were 4,000 square miles because the original Larimer County was actually included what we know as Larimer and what we know as Jackson County. It was in 1909 that Jackson County and North Park split off to be its own, and have been under those boundaries, same boundaries since. But again, we never were gold mining. We were the agricultural interests up here. But during that time period, there certainly were some mountain men that came up and did some trapping, did some trading with the Utes and the Arapahoes that were. Where did the name Larimer come from? Thank you very much. The name Larimer comes from General William Larimer. And the interesting thing is General William Larimer never set foot in what we know as Larimer County. And I got to tell you, so when you use the term general, very often back then, that was a title that was picked up in a militia. And I believe General Larimer was from, I can't remember where, in Pennsylvania. And he came out, and for those of you that have been around Colorado, if you're down in Denver, you know of Larimer Square in downtown Denver. Well, really, General Larimer was kind of a land developer and a realtor, we'd call him today, because he really developed the idea of, he's considered the father of Denver. And he actually was only out in Colorado for a few years, and then he moved back to Kansas, and I believe died in Leavenworth, Kansas. Some years later was a state senator in Kansas. So like a lot of the original founders in Colorado, they came out from all those Midwestern states and the Eastern states, and a lot of them stayed for a few years, and they packed up and they went back where they came from. And those of us that have migrated here over the years, seen the same things. A lot of folks that come and go, "This is great," and then after a few years, they go, "This is kind of rough," and they go back. So General Larimer never set foot here, but he basically founded the city of Denver. So you had us founded then, but to really understand Larimer County, you have to know the very first permanent settler of Larimer County. Anybody in here know who that is, as far as European? A guy by the name of Antoine Genesis. Now, I used to pronounce it Janus until somebody went, "Look, okay, sure, if you're not that smart of a guy. This is French, it's Genesis." Okay, it's Genesis. So Antoine actually was born and raised in Missouri, and his father, like many of the day, was a French-Canadian trapper trader. His mother was mixed race, well, they use the term mulatto in the books, probably from a slave mother and a white father. And so that he came from mixed, which part of what I like about our history is we're all kind of the troubled people that came out west. They got in trouble somewhere else, and we weren't typically of the high breed from anywhere. We were the folks that liked adventure. So that was his parents. Antoine Genesis was born in 1828, again in Missouri. Came out with his father in 1836. His father was headed up to Green River, Wyoming area. And it may have even been in what's Colorado now, but he was a trapper and a trader. And that's one of the areas, those rendezvous, mountain man rendezvous. So as they came through, Antoine and his father and a party, they came along and came across the Platte and hit what we know as the Poudre River, and they stopped at the mouth of the Poudre. And Antoine saw this area, wow, this is beautiful. It's a wonderful area. What we know is Pleasant Valley when you come out of the Poudre. And he fell in love with that area and always remembered it. But the story, and they've never nailed it down completely, but the tale of it is that as that party came through, they were the party that had so much in equipment, they couldn't move it because there was bad weather. And so they dug a pit down along what we know as the Poudre River near LaPorte, and they buried or cached their supplies, including their gunpowder. So the story of the cache La Poudre is that of them coming through, dug the hole, cached all their supplies to come back and get later. So that's the story. Nobody can nail it down, but that's the story. It's always behind the cache La Poudre. He went up there, and Antoine always remembered that area and said, someday, he was a young man when he came through, I'm going to go back up there. And so he did. In 1844, Antoine came back out, and he became very friendly with the Arapahoes that lived in the area at the time. And for whatever reason, they cut a deal and said, we will grant you all of this land that is at the mouth of the Poudre. And so Antoine left, and he was actually back and forth at Fort Laramie quite a bit. You'll see his name come up. In fact, in the treatise of 1851 and 1868, he was present at those. He came back in 58, and the Indians agreed to let him settle, and he got this semi-deed to the land, and he was the first settler there, and he founded a community they called Colonna, C-O-L-O-N-A. I don't know how they got the name Colonna. It wasn't very long before Colonna was changed to LaPorte, and we all probably know of LaPorte, an unincorporated community up northwest of Fort Collins. What you also have to know was the original Fort Collins, which was Camp Collins, was in that same area when the military was there. And the reason they were there was, as you got to the late 1850s, when they were crossing what we know as the Mormon and Oregon trails at that point in time, they'd had a lot of conflicts with the native tribes. Native tribes had gotten more hostile into that Wyoming area, so they diverted. Instead of going up to Fort Laramie and crossing up through where we know as Casper and coming across South Pass and that, they actually started diverting down to what we call the Overland Trail. They turned off basically from North Platte. They turned down to Julesburg, and they came down and really just follows. I-76 follows the South Platte River, and it splits off and then turns the Cache La Poudre. So they brought that trail down. Well, LaPorte was a natural stop for the Overland Trail because then it turned back up. And again, we put our highways where the trails were because that was just a good place to travel. So what's US 287 going up to Laramie was, they referred to as the Cherokee Trail, became the Overland Trail. And so in that period in the late 1850s, 1858, 59, Antoine Genesis settled there. He married a woman, as most of the traders and trappers of the day did, who was an Indian woman, who was Ogallala Sioux, and her name is First Elk Woman. And she's actually some kind of a sister or half-sister to Chief Red Cloud of the Sioux. And so Antoine settled that area there. And for anybody that has been down there, there's still the Bingham Hill Cemetery just south of LaPorte, if you ever get a chance to go up on Bingham Hill Road. And that was the original cemetery. Rumors that they have a child that's buried there. I have not been able to find that grave, if it's legitimately there, but that was the original area. Let me just check my time. So Antoine settled that and settled with his wife and family and really established that trading fort there before Camp Collins even showed up. Now Collins showed up again because of, they referred to as the Indian Wars. It was just too dangerous to go north. And even when they came south, they set up these military establishments to protect the coaches, because that was the key for the North, was they had to keep mail and money and things moving east to west coast. It was before the telegraph had showed up, and certainly before the Transcontinental Railroad. So it was key to keeping it open. At the same time Antoine settled that area, shortly afterwards, 1858, Mariano Medina settled on the Thompson. Anybody here know the history of Mariano? A few. Okay, good. So Mariano Medina was actually born in Taos. Maybe like, what's Taos, New Mexico? But they say actually at the time a lot of things in that region were called Taos. So it may have just been that region of New Mexico, southern Colorado. And he was of mixed race as well, but mainly of Mexican descent. And he, little guy, dressed really nice. There's great pictures of him if you go to Loveland or if you go read on Mariano. But he came up and he ran around with the likes of Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, a guy by the name of John Liver-Eaton Johnson. Anybody know John Liver-Eaton Johnson? A few? Okay. Who remembers the movie from the late 70s of Jeremiah Johnson, the Mountain Man? Jeremiah Johnson was John Liver-Eaton Johnson. And he was called that. He was also called Crow Killer because, unlike the exact piece of the movie, he was married to a flathead woman, but she was killed in a different way than the movie portrays, by Crow Indians. And he literally spent about 20 years exacting. They did it really for no reason, exacting his revenge, and was alleged to have killed over 300 Crow warriors. And everyone he killed, he cut them open and took a bite of the liver. Probably not somebody you wanted for a neighbor, but a tough fella. So he's widely known as well. But Mariano Medina ran with that same group of mountain men. His name just isn't known. But he was clear up in the Green River area and traveled that same stuff. But he settled in about 58 in what we know as the Loveland area. So next time you go down 34, when you see Minocqua Road that goes to the south off there, just before you kind of go up the hill into Loveland, by the car wash on the west side of town. Turn and go down there. So he settled, actually set the first river crossing there. Again, there was money to be made in getting people across the river. Then he built a bridge. It was his toll bridge. That's how Mariano made his money, and actually was one of the wealthiest people in Larimer County for some period of time because of that bridge and the fact that he was able to make money with that. Established what they referred to as Mariano's Crossing, because the stagecoach actually went down right through there to go down to the Denver area that we know about today, through Boulder, etc. But he established the bridge, stables, and everything. And if you go there today, there's the Minocqua Park down there. Some of the timbers in that actually came from his original structures. And as you cross the bridge over the Big Thompson there, you look a little bit to the east on the north side. That's the area where his original homestead was. And again, he set up a trading fort and had quite a reputation around the region. If you go a little further up the hill and look off to the right near a residential area, you'll find the reestablished cemetery from Mariano Medina. And it has family members buried up there, etc. They're not quite sure where he's at. They're not quite sure where his body was. They've got a marker, but they're not sure they actually got the right person. But he was the guy, the same period that we had Antoine Genesis on the north end, we had Mariano Medina on the south end. And they really started to establish us as a county. And the important thing was they got people across those two rivers, because river crossings back then were not something that were easy to do. So it was established that way. Now, an interesting bit on Mariano, unlike Antoine that married the Sioux woman, Antoine got his wife a little different way, because another trader decided he was done. Like I said to people, you know, this whole mountain thing's enough. Well, the traders typically took Indian wives. Well, he was going to go back east, but he couldn't take his Indian wife and his son with him, so he basically traded or sold them to Mariano, and Mariano took her as a wife, and her name escapes me right now, but he affectionately called her John. And so John was Mariano's wife, had the son, raised the son as his own, and they had many other children after. And if you ever get a chance to read or go to the museum in Loveland, you'll find a lot more about Mariano Medina. But again, so in an area when we talk about, we're dealing with diversity issues, richest man in this county was a Mexican immigrant that came up with an Indian wife. And certainly, if we look at that as well with Antoine Genesis, he was a man of great stature at the time as well, and came from, you know, mixed family, mixed race, everything else. Another character I have to weave into this, I told you I was going to talk about lawmen and a little bit about outlaws, is a guy by the name of Jack Slade. Does that ring a bell with anybody in here? You heard of Jack Slade. The general stories of Jack Slade is he's nothing but a bandit and a bad guy. There's actually a lot more to him. Jack Slade came out, and again from Missouri. He originally, as a very young man, worked on the wagon trains going to Santa Fe and got familiar with the West. And again, young boys at the time often got put into labor. So he did that, became familiar with the area, and when they started those routes coming west, he came out to Fort Laramie, ended up getting hooked up with a guy by the name of Jack Holiday, that began the stagecoach line, the overland stagecoach line, that the federal government said we got to keep mail and things moving. And that stage line went all through Nebraska, basically followed the Platte, and then when the South Platte came off, he came down, it turned there, it came through Julesburg, etc., and down to LaPorte, and then back up. Now, his wife was a little bit different. His wife was rumored to be a prostitute from Denver, a European woman, and her name, this may seem familiar if you haven't put it together, her name is Virginia Dale. If you've been up 287, you know of the community known as Virginia Dale. Well, that's named after Jack Slade's wife, and actually, if you haven't been up there, just a few miles before the state line, probably about 5 or 6 miles, there's a little marker, it says historical marker, and it turns you off to the right, and you kind of got to follow some roads you think you probably shouldn't be on, but you can if the gates are open. The old Virginia Dale stage station that was named after Virginia Dale, and where Jack and Virginia lived for several years, actually still up there, and the locals keep it up. Amazing history. It's really awesome. But Jack ran that line. Interesting thing was, extremely capable man and I don't have time to go into the details with him other than to run that line, because he came out here and there was no law. He's trying to run the stagecoach line. There's stories of he caught some folks along 287, I think it was the old 10-mile stage stop, that were stealing horses from him. And Jack did what you did at that point in time, because there's no law. He took them out and he hanged them. And the point was, he had to send a message. He had to keep that stage line running. So he hanged those two bandits. He also got into it with a guy by the name of Jules Beni, B-E-N-I, or Benny. And Jules was running the stage stop in an area we now know as Julesburg, Colorado. Same name after that. And Jules was running that. Well, Jack found out that Jules, they were always having things stolen. Hay was being stolen, etc., and had to be replaced. Well, Jack figured out that Jules Benet, he wasn't the victim of the thefts as the stage master. He was actually behind him, and he was reselling it and then getting restocked with it. So there was a little bad blood there, and it's a long story, but there was bad blood, and at one point, Jules Benet decided he was going to have it with Jack Slade for cracking down on him, and he shot Jack up in what we know as Julesburg. Shot him 2 or 3 or 4 times, kind of one of those dirty shootings, didn't shoot him from the front, snuck up on him. They must didn't kill Jack Slade. They put Jack on a stagecoach and took him all the way back along that line, along the Platte River, clear back to Missouri, got him a doctor, and Jack Slade survived. Now, Jack sort of held a little bit of a grudge for Jules. And many years later, he did exact his revenge. I believe it was up in Wyoming, came across him and killed Jules. In doing so, again, he kind of became known as an outlaw for that, but after he killed him, rumor has it he cut off both of Jules's ears and kept them in his vest pockets as a little bit of keepsakes at the time. But in ways you look at Jack as someone who you know, pretty rough character, but there was no law. Jack did what Jack needed to do to keep the stage line open. And again, very capable man, but he had a weakness. Anybody want to guess what Jack's weakness was? Well, yeah, a little bit. Mainly it was the other one. What's the other thing that gets men in trouble? Well, alcohol. Jack and his whiskey. Whoo! Jack was infamous, whether he was up in LaPorte or he was down in Denver. He was extremely capable, but he came in on the coach, and if he got into the whiskey, he wasn't real good at it. And Jack would just get absolutely violent. There's stories about Jack coming into the general store in LaPorte and getting drunk and destroying the store, dumping molasses and flour and everything. Funny thing is, when he'd go through all that stuff, next day he'd sober up and he'd wake up and he'd apologize for the damage, he'd pay for the damage and go on his way. And so that was kind of Jack Slade. Again, he did some amazing things in how he kept that stage line open through all sorts of, Indian raids, bandits, whatever. But Jack had a real weakness with the whiskey, and finally, I think about 1866, I believe, they had about enough, and Jack and Virginia Dale Jack was fired from the stage line, and he was run off. Ended up in a place called Virginia City, Montana. Anybody spent time up there? Old mining area, Virginia City. So Jack ended up pushed up there, and unfortunately he went back to his old ways, drinking and whatnot. And finally a vigilance committee was formed up there and said, we've had about enough of Jack Slade, and they hanged Jack Slade in Virginia City, Montana. As he was being hanged, Virginia Dale was riding in from their homestead, which was several miles out of town. According to the story, she got there just after Jack was hanged. And so that he is a good example of, that was a period of time there just really wasn't any law. So as we got into it and we got the Colorado territories, they established the county offices. They established the commissioners, the sheriff, the treasurer, the clerk, etc. Now what you have to understand, the original sheriffs, they really weren't what we think of them. The old westerns always romanticize stuff. We always think of the old sheriff out looking for the criminals. Honestly, a sheriff, and again I've read all the stuff, we didn't have a lot of law enforcement. We did 2 things mostly. The first one was civil process, and that was serving papers for the courts. People sued other people or anything between people, and then they ran a county jail. Now the jail never was at that point in time meant to incarcerate people on a sentence. You just simply held them till the judge came around, because in Larimer County back in the 1860s, the judge came around once a quarter. So you didn't want to be stuck in the jail waiting for the judge to come around. And so that only happened on felony cases. Misdemeanor cases, that what we know as the term misdemeanor, comes from the same root word of misdeed. It was the small thing. So mostly if it was a misdemeanor, a minor crime, you had to sue the person. The law didn't get involved. The courts didn't on your behalf. If it was a minor theft, it was an assault, it was a property transaction issue, you had to sue them, but you paid the sheriff to serve those papers so you could get them into civil court the next time that the judge was around. So the role of the sheriff was not so much in law enforcement as it was you still had to kind of take care of it yourself. So if you look at it, one of the things that I share with people is government didn't do a lot for you at that point in time. You had to do it for yourself. And if you had money, you could pay to sue somebody. You could pay to have a private detective look into it. You could pay to bring criminal charges. Not that the sheriff wouldn't, but the sheriffs mainly got by on those fees because the counties had almost no money, so everything that was done was really done on fees. The sheriff's fees were set. They mostly were like 25 cents to $1. Now, the one fee that was big, $25, was for performing an execution, because the sheriff had to build the gallows and everything else. Didn't happen a lot, but the sheriff got paid. The judges got paid for every case they tried. The DAs got paid for every conviction they got. Probably not a real good system set up, paid for your convictions. So in that point in time, that was the original part of what the sheriff did. They ran the jails. That was pretty much it. Now, sheriffs also at the time, they hadn't established a lot of the other things. So the sheriffs oftentimes ran the elections. When you had an election, the sheriff was considered that one person that could run it. Sheriff oftentimes was a tax collector at that point in time as well. Made sure that delinquent, the guy with the gun was pretty good at collecting the taxes where the others weren't. So that was kind of how the original law came into the land. And I just remind people, we came from a period of time, first of all, when Jack Slade was here, you had to do it on your own. And then after that, yeah, you had government, but you kind of had to pay to play, because there just wasn't a lot of money in the system. So we developed from that over the years where the sheriffs do handle law enforcement. Now, if you look at the statutes, it talks about the duty of the sheriff. The only thing it talks about law enforcement is a duty to, one, keep the peace, and two is suppress riots and affrays. And I found an affray is just kind of a big disturbance. So that was what the sheriff really was, to keep the peace. Now, I do believe from all my readings, the sheriff would come in when you had, again, liquor was a huge problem, especially when you had minors. And you had a lot of men without women. You ladies still know about that. When there's men without women, there's whiskey and stupid stuff goes on. So they had a lot of that to deal with. But oftentimes, from what I can tell, the individual that was arrested out of the saloon was probably thrown in jail for the night, maybe administered a small, there was no court case with it. Sheriff kind of kept the peace, threw him in jail, let him sober up, kicked him back out the next day. So that's a lot of it. Now, in addition to the sheriff, in the very early days of the territory, they also, because the sheriff was covering a whole county, and Larimer, 4,000 square miles, a lot of area to cover, and they recognized you had local issues going on. So they actually created the office of constable. And so within certain districts they could create, which I think are probably similar to how we ended up with towns these days, they would put in a justice of the peace, which was kind of the lowest level of judge. A lot of times you think of it kind of like a municipal judge, and then they would have a constable assigned to each one of those who did the same kind of process of civil service, also kept the peace. And if you go back and look at it, the interesting thing is they even had laws on the books back in the 1860s that talked about things like stray dogs. We dealt with those same kind of issues. And so those kind of issues would come up to the constable. So prior to having towns and cities that were established, we kind of had districts within the county where you had a lot of people living and the sheriff wasn't around enough. You had the constable that kept the peace as well. So you saw that system develop over the years. And again, the sheriffs got paid not to investigate crime. They got paid mileage to go out and deal with a specific issue by the county. They weren't given a car. They simply had to go out and do it on their own. But as we saw these things form, we saw the civilizations. We saw things come together. Our communities, we got the rule of law that we're at more today, where you can pick up the phone if you feel like somebody's threatening your property or person, and you can call and expect a local police officer or a deputy sheriff comes out. And I share that because that was not the original history of our area. We were pretty much on our own. But interesting stories. We're down to about 10 minutes left, and what I guess I'd like to do here is just wrap with an opportunity to let you guys pose some questions, play a little stump the sheriff if you can. Again, I'm not an expert on local history, but I continue to study the stuff about this area, who we are, who settled here. Fort Collins, Larimer County, again, was big in the ag part, and that's really been our history. If you didn't know it, Fort Collins was actually the sheep capital of the United States back in the early 1900s. For anybody that's been in Fort Collins, the Fort Collins High School mascot's the Lambkins. Not the toughest mascot you ever seen, but the story, because what came later, as people came, you had the farmers and followed by the ranchers and the sheep herders. And obviously a lot of stories of the wars between the cattle ranchers and the sheep herders as well. But amazing, interesting history. I could go into some others, but you guys got questions or anything you'd like me to comment on? Yes?
So is there homesteading in that situation? Is it just what you fence in, you control? How does that work between the ranchers and the
Excellent. So when you look at that, originally, we really saw that settlement kick in after the Civil War, when the land grants came out. They'd set that up to say a lot of these former soldiers, let's get them some land, a place of their own. 160 acres back in the day. Now with that, there was a lot of shysters that sold people. If you got on the eastern plains of Colorado, you'll see the remnants of all these towns that were formed in the 1870s and 1880s, because there were some wet years, and they convinced people you could farm on this in 160 acres. You never could make it. But what we ran into was some of those cattle barons came in, and when these were open lands, they simply, especially after the Civil War, they took a lot of the free cattle that were left during the war and became unbranded as they bred over the years, gathered them up. They created these huge ranches, and these are the kind of things we deal with today. They took advantage of nobody really owned the land in their mind. Obviously, we had issues with the land being taken from the native inhabitants at the time, but beyond that, they laid it out. Familiar with the Johnson County War in the Bighorns in Wyoming, very north end along where kind of I-25 is. They called the Johnson County War because they had the cattle barons, and they just settled. We got hundreds of thousands of acres we have access to. We move our cattle. This is ours. Well, the funny thing is, people figured out they could do the homestead. So the small farmers and ranchers came in, and they filed for those little land patents for their 160 acres, and they filed them right along where the rivers were, because number one, their livestock that they brought with them, a little bit they had, could water out of that because that's dry area, and they could also use that water to farm. Well, the big ranchers didn't much care for that. So the story of the Johnson County Wars, where the cattle barons decided that they thought the farmers and the small ranchers there were rustling their cattle, so they hired outside guns to come in, and there was a couple of killings of locals, and so the local farmers got together, and they went to a place called the T8. If you're up by Casey, Wyoming, look this stuff up, and you'll find markers along the way, because they were first. A couple of guys were killed just along the area. Ranger Jones and John Tisdale were their names. And then at the Casey Ranch, these hired guns came in, were firing on them. And so the small ranchers that's had enough, they surrounded them at the TA Ranch and were waiting to kill them all. When the cavalry came in and separated them out, rumor has it they arrested the hired guns and hauled them off to Cheyenne. The short version is they got away with it. The longer version that I read in another book, I got 5 more minutes, was that, again, you talk about the pay issue, that Johnson County didn't have the money to pay for holding the prisoners or the prosecution, so they were turned loose. Oftentimes you look at those cases back in that period of time, there wasn't much justice because judges were bought off, jurors were bought off, and sheriffs had pretty shoddy jails to start with, and so prisoners escaped, or they'd pay the jailer to get out. So even if you had a case, oftentimes people get away, which reminds me, in my 5 minutes, I got a great story, my favorite jail story. There was a sheriff in Gilpin County, down Black Hawk, Central City, and if you look at that, that's still, I call it a postage stamp sized county, because that was a huge gold area at the time. So they made a very small geographic county so they could take care of the mines. Well, the first sheriff there, his name was Billy Cozens, in a book that was written in the very early 1900s. Again, I got a copy of it because I found it on eBay. Billy Cozens tells the story. He was the first sheriff, and they typically would arrest people, arrested some horse thieves, and they would take them down to Jefferson County. Even then, Jefferson was a bigger county. They could take them to the jail. Well, one day, Billy Cozens arrests a couple of horse thieves. It's too late in the day to do anything, so he decides, I'm just going to take them back to the apartment he lived in Central City, and handcuff him, shackle him to the bed. Well, what Billy really didn't think about, gentlemen, was his wife and the newborn child in the same room. So he brings these two bandits in and says, one word out of either one of you. You make any noise, I'll kill you right there where you lay, because my wife and our newborn child were there. And according to the story, they laid quietly all night long, sure that Billy would do it, and got through the night. His wife woke up the next morning, very nicely rolled over and told Billy, you will never do this again. You will never bring an inmate into this house. And whether she was bluffing or not, Billy believed it because he never did. And so after that, he takes his prisoners down, and he comes back up, and he meets with the county commissioners. Again, it's a brand new county. They have no money. And he says, commissioners, I know you don't have money. We need to build a jail. We don't have any money for a jail. I need you to order me to build a jail. Well, we don't really, they said, no, just order me. So in the end, they say, okay, I don't know where this is going, but Billy, you got no money, but build a jail. So Billy goes out and he finds what he refers to as all the bums and ruffians laying around that aren't working in the mining camp, and says, guess what? You're under arrest and you're in my custody until, and he found the ones that knew how to do woodwork and how to cut logs and the masons, and you're not going to be let go until my jail's built. And they said, what for? How can you take us into custody? He said, look, we're in the Colorado Territory. You know and I know, if I was to do enough digging, y'all are wanted somewhere for a crime, and do you want me to do the digging and find that and send you back, or do you just want to help me build a jail? So they came together, and in a matter of several weeks, built Billy Cozen's his first jail for no money up in Gilpin County, and that's how things got started. So we were in an area you just didn't have much. But there's more stories called the Old Sheriff, stories of Billy Cozen's and how he just got by with stuff. So again, amazing characters, the lawmen, the bandits. It was an interesting time. The settlement of this area was so fast. We were critical to the survival of the Union because they needed the gold out of these mines. And so they fought it. Anybody familiar with the Battle of Glorieta Pass? Okay, Battle of Glorieta Pass, a few of you nodded, was actually in New Mexico, and it's also referred to as the Gettysburg of the West. And I'll just tell you this one real quick, that the Confederates were coming up out of Texas because they wanted to seize the gold fields, deprive the Union of them. And so they were coming up, and the Colorado governor found out they were coming up here, and all he had was the Colorado militia. He didn't have federal troops, so he actually got in trouble because he ordered his militia to go into the New Mexico territory to cut them off. But they got down there, they met up with the Confederate troops, and if you look at the actual battle of it, the Confederates really won on the sides there. But what happened is a band of the Colorado militia cavalry went out. They found the supply train for those Confederate troops and just decimated, burned the wagons and everything. So after that battle was over, even though the Confederates had won on the battlefield, they had to retreat back to Texas. And they never came back up after that. And they said that was a pivotal battle. We don't think of that. We think, we think of all the battles out east, the Fredericksburgs, Battle of Bull Run. The stuff really, a big piece of that turned out here because they kept them from getting the gold fields. And the interesting piece was the person who was the hero of that battle was a guy by the name of Shivington, the same John Shivington we know as the real devil or the demon of the Sand Creek Massacre, who was a colonel at the time. And again, he snuck out when the governor wasn't here to commit the Sand Creek Massacre. So again, the stories are amazing. What happened in that short time period, that late 1850s, 1860s, and how we really were such a part of it. And we came together so fast, I would offer. We didn't have much of a territorial or state government. It's one of the reasons we're big in local control in Colorado, because it fell to the counties to do that stuff. Today, counties in Colorado have more power than most any other state because we just had that tradition where people like to keep government local. With that, I am right up to 8 o'clock. Wow, thank you for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you had a good time. Thank you for coming out. And I'll stick around for a while if anybody has any questions.
So as the duties evolve from being an administrator to being an enforcer, was the general struggle? Was the death rate go up? Was the lifespan of a sheriff?
So most sheriffs only spend 2 years in office, they have a 2-year term.
Okay.
Most of them
Yes, that's a good idea. It's so horrible.
They do. I know they're smart.
by the name of Cook, Dave Cook, created what they call the Rocky Mountain Detective Association. Cook actually
Found your bed.
livestock that's still
Hanging in there.
He was the sheriff of
And you?
Chase County once with the telegram.